So Baldur's Gate 3 launches in a few more weeks, and there's a big challenge ahead for all of us. Who should we pick as our first class? There are 12 classes and 46 subclasses in total, and today I'm going to break them down for you in the simplest way possible. There will be a point in which the game lets you switch classes, but this is all information that you're going to want to know anyway. Also, to celebrate the launch of BG3, I'm doing a giveaway for 2 copies of the game on a platform of your choice. All you have to do is to be a subscriber of the channel, leave a like on this video, and comment below who's going to be your first main and why. Starting with the Barbarian class, these are primarily physical fighters who embrace their wild side and use their unbridled, unquenchable rage to gain bonus damage and even gain extra attacks later on. At the core of this class sits their Rage class action, which lets the Barbarian deal extra damage but also gain extra resistances for 10 turns. This class focuses a lot on stats like Strength and Constitution and are generally much better melee fighters than they are with ranged weapons. In terms of proficiencies, Barbarians are proficient with light and medium armor, shield, simple weapons, and martial weapons. However, this class starts with more hit points than the rest and can even adopt an unarmored playstyle via their unarmored defense class passive. This makes their body as resilient as any armor while still remaining more mobile in combat when they need to. There are 3 subclasses that Barbarians can choose between. This includes Berserker, Wild Magic, and Wild Heart. Berserker further deepens that bond with the rage mechanic with a new ability called Frenzy, which lets Barbs perform a Frenzy Strike as a bonus action, so you can attack more often in the same turn. Wild Heart deepens your attunement with nature and lets you choose from several different creatures to get inspired by, which in turn will alter the effects provided by rage. For example, if you choose Bear Heart, this can make your rage to massively boost your resistances and even gain a healing mechanic. Something like Tiger Heart gives you a Bloodlust mechanic, which lets you attack more enemies at once and even apply a bleed over time. Or something like Eagle Heart lets you do a Divine Strike Leap ability that knocks enemies prone and completely avoids fall damage for you. Wild Magic is the last one, and this gives a random rolling Wild Surge when you use your rage, which can provide different magical effects like infusing your weapons with magical damage, provide extra resistances, even shoot bolts of light out of your own chest. The Bard class is the next one, and you can think of these as musicians that also use magic. This is a versatile class that inspires your party, mostly fitting a support role, but can also deal great damage on its own with certain melee builds. At the core of this class sits their Bardic Inspiration, which inspires allies to gain a bonus on their next attack roll, ability check, or saving roll. The Bard already starts with a number of great support spells, debuffs, and even healing mechanics right from the start, though their spell kit is somewhat limited compared to some of the pure casters of this game. Unique to this class is that they can choose a musical instrument to play, which is mostly there for RP, but you can obviously find a lot more as you play. Plus, this ability to play instruments can also be used as a means of distraction against enemies when your party does something else. In terms of proficiencies, Bard is proficient with light armor and can also get medium armor proficiency with certain subclasses. Meanwhile, for weapons, they are proficient with simple, hand crossbows, long swords, rapiers, and short swords weapons. Subclasses wise, there are 3 that Bards can choose between, including College of Valor, College of Lore, as well as College of the Sword. Now, each is going to let the Bards to specialize more into certain class mechanics. For example, the College of Lore, this gains a really interesting class mechanic called Cutting Words, essentially turning you into an insult machine that completely saps enemies of their confidence and as such makes them fail more often on attack rolls, ability checks, and the damage that they deal. Meanwhile, bards that are part of the College of Valor wander the land to witness and relate the deeds of the mighty. This provides them with combat inspiration skill, which can buff your party members way beyond their capabilities to further deal more damage on top of the bonuses provided by the bardic inspiration. Finally, there's also the College of Swords. This gains additional proficiency for the bard with additional medium armor and scimitars. They can even use blade flourish mechanics to gain extra effects when hitting enemies, including damage to additional targets, gain extra defenses, and even push enemies back. Moving more into the spellcaster category, let's talk about clerics. These are representatives of the gods that they worship, wielding potent divine magic for both good or ill. You can think of these as religious fighters, a more support-centric class that works best as healers, but they can also be specced into dealing damage. Now, Clerics start with a great selection of support and enemy debuff spells early on, but not as much on offenses compared to other spellcasters. Guiding Bolt is probably going to be your highest single target damage early on, which also provides advantage against that target for 2 more turns afterwards. This class also gains access to prepared spells, which lets you easily switch spells in and out when outside of combat and better prepare for the fights ahead. In terms of proficiency, Clerics have shield and simple weapon proficiency as well as light and medium armor. However, certain Cleric subclasses such as the Light Domain can expand that to also include heavy armor. In terms of the subclasses, there are several you can choose between, including Life, Light, Trickery, Knowledge, Nature, Tempest, and the War Domain. Going over these quickly, Life Domain further empowers your healing spells to regain even more hit points, gain access to stronger variants of the healing spells that you already have, and just perform much better as a support-centric class. Light Domain focuses a bit more on offenses with access to additional fire spells like the Burning Hands and Scorching Ray in case you also want to have additional access to those. Meanwhile, Trickery expands a bit more into stealth gameplay, providing confusion against enemies and other useful debuffs. And there's also the War Domain that turns you into a combat-centric kind of Cleric, gaining bonus weapon attack actions and later on ways to infuse your weapons with divine energy. Speaking of the Druids, these are the masters of nature magic who can also transform into creatures and gain different unique abilities from them. They already start with a good number of healing, support, and damage spells right from the get-go, including ones that can be prepared. At level 2, Druids gain the Wild Shape ability, which lets them assume the form of several different creatures, including wolf, bear, cat, spider, and eventually even owlbear and dire raven with certain subclasses. Now, the bear form further boosts your HP and also gains a roar ability that taunts enemies to attack you so that you can take some of the heat off your party members. Wolf form has several unique skills, including a howl that can grant additional movement speed to you and your entire party, as well as an exposing bite that leaves enemies more vulnerable. There are plenty more like the spider that can spit webs and reduce enemies' movement, or raven which can avoid detection and even blind enemies with the rend vision skill. Now, Druids also have light and medium armor proficiency, as well as shield, club, dagger, javelin, mace, quarterstaff, scimitar, sickle, and spear weapons. In terms of the subclasses, there are 3 circles that they can attune to, including the Circle of Land, Circle of Moon, and the Circle of Spores. Now, Moon Druids, they focus a lot more on the Wild Shape class action to gain an even more powerful version of that, which in turn gives them access to more beast forms. Plus, it counts as a bonus action now, letting them transform twice per short rest compared to before. The Circle of Land Druids, they have a bigger focus on the spellcasting side of things, letting you gain additional spell slots and even more unique spells to use in combat. Meanwhile, Spore Druids find beauty in decay, being capable of unleashing spores that deal necrotic damage and even reanimate corpses of your fallen enemies for you to use. This subclass even lets you channel the power of your wild shape into your spores and gain various buffs to damage, gain more hit points, and so on. Now, the Fighter is another class that focuses on the physical side of combat. However, they can also dive a little bit into spell usage. They have mastered the art of combat, wielding weapons with unmatched skill and wearing armor like a second skill. Having the ability to choose between different fighting styles lets fighters to specialize more into different key areas such as archery, which provides extra damage with ranged weapons, defenses to gain extra armor class points, dueling, which provides bonus damage when wielding weapons only in one hand, but they also gain access to great weapon fighting, protection, and 2-weapon fighting. Once they hit level 2, fighters also gain the action surge ability, which lets them go beyond their limit and gain 1 additional action, which is incredible as it lets you attack more times per turn, completely destroying enemies. And then in level 5, you gain an extra attack too, so in total you hit enemies more times per turn than almost any other class. In terms of proficiencies, fighters have light, medium, and heavy armor proficiency, shield, simple, and martial weapons, and you can also build fighters however you want as a result, from agile bow wielders to heavy melee hitters all the way to resilient tanks. Now, for subclasses, fighters have 3 different options to pick between, including Champion, Eldritch Knight, and Battlemaster. Starting with the Battlemasters, these are paragons of tactical superiority and their attacks are fueled by their superiority dice. At level 3, you can choose up to 3 of the 6 possible maneuvers to spend your dice on, including extra damage and the possibility to frighten enemies on hit, push enemies back, rally allies to gain more hit points, and so on. Meanwhile, Eldritch Knight, this provides a unique twist to this class by also giving it access to spells it can pick between starting with level 3. This also includes really great options like the Magic Missile or the Thunder Wave, and with a few exceptions, most of these options are offensive attacks anyway. Moving on to more hybrid type classes, let's talk about the Paladin. These fighters are fueled by their oath to uphold justice and righteousness, similar to Clerics except with a bigger focus on damage. Paladins already start with a great heal from level 1 called Lay on Hands, so they can really go hand on hand against anyone, though this will consume a Lay on Hand charge as you use this ability. However, one of the Paladin's most defining features is the Divine Smite, and starting level 2 you have access to several different smite attacks. This attack lets you expand a spell slot to deal extra radiant damage to enemies, but some of the others can have different effects on top too, such as Thunderous Smite, which is also capable to knock down enemies prone, or Wrathful Strike, which can cause enemies to become frightened and also gain disadvantage. Additionally, there are plenty other support spells to pick between as you level up, which Paladins can also switch in and out when outside of combat via the prepared spells. In terms of proficiencies, Paladins have light, medium, and heavy armor proficiency, as well as proficiency with shields, simple, and martial weapons. Plus, with the option between different fighting styles, Paladins have quite a few options when they gear up. Now, Paladins can also choose to uphold an oath that they can give, including the Oath of Devotion, of Ancients, of Vengeance, or even delve into the Oathbreaker. Now, Oath of the Ancients focuses a lot more on healing, but also gains access to additional druid-like spells such as Nature Wrath and Ensnare. Meanwhile, Oath of Devotion Paladins are sworn to act with honor and virtue to protect the weak and pursue the greater good. However, doing actions such as killing innocents or somebody who isn't hostile can put you on a path to become an Oathbreaker. And this is pretty interesting because it has its own cinematics, you can kind of RP into it, and there's also a way to reverse back, but it kind of gives you access to the Oathbreaker instead. So this special subclass can be reversed at some point, but it does provide you access to a more evil type Paladin that uses necrotic spells to really make their enemies suffer and later on even reanimate the dead to their advantage. Finally, the Oath of Vengeance Paladins hound their foes in merciless pursuit and deliver swift justice. With this subclass, you gain lots of very powerful damage spells to use in combat and further buff your abilities. Moving on to the Rangers, these are unrivaled scouts and trackers, honing a deep connection with nature in order to hunt their favorite prey. One of this class's unique mechanics is the ability to pick a favorite enemy, giving them access to additional perks, cantrips, and spells useful for a variety of situations. So this includes Ensnare Strike via Bounty Hunter, True Strike from Magebreaker, but there are plenty other options for both defenses and utility. Now this lets them really jump into a variety of diverse roles, no matter if they use melee or ranged weapons. Similarly, they can also choose to excel in attuning with different beasts or surviving in certain environments such as cold, fire, and poison. However, some of these can provide unique new features like being able to cast an additional familiar, to have 2 pets with you at the same time, especially if you pick Beastmaster subclass, or even access to a set of Thieves tools that lets you open, among other things, closed doors, which is actually more useful than you might think. As far as proficiencies go, Rangers have proficiency with shields, simple and martial weapons, as well as light and medium armor. However, picking something like the Ranger Knight can also give it heavy armor proficiency. For the subclasses, there are 3 to pick between, including Beastmaster, Hunter, and Gloomstalker. Now, Beastmaster, this leans the heaviest into animal companionship, as Rangers of this subclass can summon companions at their side, and this can include wolves, bears, spiders, boars, and ravens, each with their own unique advantages and skills. Hunters, on the other hand, specialize in dealing with the most dangerous of enemies, including giant creatures, against which they gain extra damage when below a certain hit point, or even gain extra reactions and effects on your attacks. Finally, the Gloomstalkers, these lean a bit more into the stealthy gameplay, even gaining a form of invisibility while in dark areas, gain more movement speed, and even extra attacks via the disguise Self-Gloom magic type. Moving over to the Rogue, this is another pretty straightforward kind of class which prioritizes stealth and speed, dealing huge damage, and their uncanny reflexes lets them get the upper hand in almost any situation. At the core of this class, we have the sneak attack, which works both for melee as well as ranged weapons in providing a massive damage boost against enemies that you have advantage against. So this includes most commonly enemies who have the high ground on when attacking from the back, who don't detect you yet, who are prone, paralyzed, and so on. Rogues also have the cunning actions, including an extra dash and disengage, which unlike the normal variants, can be used without provoking opportunity attacks from enemies and are also cast as bonus actions. This will make going in and out of combat very easy for the rogue class. Furthermore, this class also has light armor proficiency as well as proficiency with simple weapons, hand crossbows, long swords, rapiers, and short swords. For the subclasses, we gain access to 3 of them, including Thief, Arcane Trickster, as well as the Assassin. Now, Thief, this gives access to an additional bonus action via the Fast Hand skill, so you can actually use more attacks in one single round. Plus, you also get the second story work, which provides more resistance from fall damage, which comes in handy when repositioning from and to high ground. Arcane Trickster, on the other hand, is a rogue with a clever touch of magic, so another hybrid kind of subclass that gives access to extra spells, including a range of really great offenses, but also utility skills. Finally, we also have the Assassin with a greater focus on the grim art of death. These are hired killers, spies, bounty hunters who are at their deadliest when using the assassination skill against unsuspecting enemies. This gives you an advantage on creatures that haven't taken a turn yet in combat or even guarantee critical hits against surprised enemies. Now from here, there are 3 different almost pure spellcasters that lean even more into casting magic. And starting with the wizard, these are spellcasters who can learn their magic from books and even specialize in individual schools of magic. Right from the start, this class begins with a huge selection of spells, probably the highest in the game, including prepared spells to swap between at any time when not in combat, making them a very strong option from quite early on. This includes magic missiles and spells like the Thunder Wave, both really great options throughout the game. Magic Missile is a great guarantee multi-hit that can be used on more than one target, while the Thunder Wave is great at pushing enemies off high cliffs and other high points. Additionally, wizards can also learn spells permanently from the scrolls that you get while playing, though this can only be done in exchange for money. In terms of proficiencies, wizards don't get any armor proficiency, however they do get some with dagger, quarterstaff, and light crossbows. It doesn't really matter, however, since you're primarily going to be focusing on casting spells, and there's going to be a large array of options to pick between over here. The fact that you also get access to extra spell slots as you level makes it almost always worth it to have one wizard in your party. But as a wizard, you can also dedicate yourself to one of the 8 schools of magic that you can really excel into if you really like a certain type of magic. So this includes abjuration, conjuration, divination, enchantment, evocation, necromancy, illusion, and transmutation. So for example, if you really like damage spells, you can focus on evocation, which also lets your party to not take damage from the spells that you use in case they are in range. Abjuration can even give you a damage absorption ward once per day that can replenish itself. And there's others in there that can even dive into necromancy, letting you reap the life out of your enemies, and even use something like animate the undead to make them fight at your side. Outside of this, there's also the Sorcerer, which is somewhat similar to Wizard, except that they draw their magic from their bloodlines rather than through books. So Sorcerers have access to a somewhat more limited pool of spells outright compared to the Wizards, and even lose access to the prepared spells, but they do gain a different and more interesting kind of class effect called Meta Magic starting with level 2. So you can choose between several different effects to further affect the spells that you cast on enemies. So for example, you can grab the Twin spell, which lets you cast spells on one additional target, but there's others in there that let you increase the range from which you can cast spells, double their duration, even guarantee advantage rolls, or make them use bonus actions instead, so you can have more casts per turn. Proficiency-wise, just like wizards, sorcerers really don't have any proficiency except with daggers, quarterstaffs, and light crossbows, but not with armor. However, certain subclasses like the Draconic Bloodline can enhance your hit points and even provide a bit of armor class boost so that you can survive a bit better. So the three subclasses that sorcerers get access to are Draconic Bloodline, Wild Magic, and Storm Sorcery. So Draconic Bloodline, which also gives you these really cool skills and other RP elements, these sorcerers can choose one of the 10 dragon ancestors and as such gain a bonus resistance to the element that they represent, plus a bonus damage later on of that type of spell. Each one of these choices also provide an additional spell on top, such as Ancestry Red giving you Burning Hands, or Blue giving Witch Bolt, or even Green, which comes with a Ray of Sickness. And you also get the Draconic Resilience for the HP and armor class boost like I just said. Wild Magic, on the other hand, adds a fun twist for casting spells by randomly triggering a magical effect when casting these spells. This can include hitting additional enemies, setting everyone around you on fire, getting summoned companions, and so on. There's a lot of possible effects, but not all of them are necessarily going to be extremely powerful. Some might even be detrimental to your own party. Storm Sorcery, which buffs your own damage with lightning spells. This also lets you manipulate the wind and fly over the battlefield without triggering opportunity attacks from enemies. So in turn, this is going to be probably one of the most mobile sorcerers in the entire game. The final type of spellcasters are going to be the Warlocks, and they draw their magic from the pack that they forge with an all-powerful patron, trading their loyalty for supernatural abilities and unique magic. Warlocks don't start with many options early on and instead rely on a few key attacks that can later on be buffed with more interesting effects. One of the staples of this class is the Eldritch Blast, also one of the more preferred and popular options. Plus, it also counts as a cantrip, which means it doesn't consume from the already limited spell slots that Warlocks start with. But starting with level 2, you can choose between different Eldritch invocations, such as Repelling or Agonizing Blast, to make that skill also, for example, push enemies or even gain an extra charisma damage modifier on top. But there are other similar effects for some of the other spells that you can also choose between and gain different powerful effects. For proficiency, again, just light armor and simple weapons, which means you're mostly going to spend your time spellcasting. Now, Warlocks can also form pacts, as I've said, with certain patrons and gain different benefits and spells out of them. And this brings us to the three types of subclasses that they can access, including the Fiend, the Great Old One, and the Archfey. So Warlocks, in service to the Fiends, focus more on corruption, being able of casting tendrils of dark energy via the arms of Hadar, and other different dark magic effects, including a subclass feature called Dark One's Blessing. This one lets you gain extra hit points when reducing an enemy's own hit points to 0. There's also the Great Old One, which gains the Mortal Reminder subclass feature, which makes enemies to become frightened when landing critical hits against them. And finally, the Archfey. Warlocks of this type, while not accessible yet in the early access, get fairy-like abilities, which can cause multiple enemies, for example, to become frightened, gain the ability to vanish into Puff of Mists, and even become immune to charms while boosting their own. And finally, this brings us to the Monk class, currently unavailable in the early access, but instead of using swords, this class uses martial weapons like fists, harnessing the power of their body in their pursuit for physical and spiritual perfection. Monks can disrupt the flow of chi in opponents' bodies, which in turn can end up with different interesting effects, such as stunning them, but their mastery over chi can eventually even make them gain extra actions, avoid certain area of effects, and even gain complete immunity to certain ailments like disease, poison, and even aging effects. In terms of proficiency, they only have simple weapon and short sword proficiency, but no armor proficiency to speak of. That's why this brings us to the different subclasses they have access to with different focuses that you're probably going to be really excited for. This includes the Way of the Four Elements, Way of the Open Hand, and Way of the Shadows. So Way of Open Hands, this further specializes in unarmed combat, using your hands and your control of chi to heal or inflict grievous hurt. This includes forcing a flurry of blows on the enemy target with different effects, including knocking enemies prone, pushing them very far away, and so on. Way of the Shadow is kind of like the ninja or shadow dancer version of the monk class. They value stealth and subterfuge above everything else and can even serve as spies and assassins. This includes using the power of shadow to become invisible or even step through darkness and gain an advantage on your next melee attack. Finally, monks that follow the way of the 4 elements focus their chi to band elements at their will, allowing them to cast spells and even use them like an extension of their own bodies. Overall, really excited for Baldur's Gate 3 and when the game fully launches. Of course, this is probably going to be one of the biggest highlights of this year, and honestly, I think it's such an amazing game from what I was able to play up until now. More will follow soon, so if you want to stay up to date with everything Baldur's Gate 3 related, including guides, gameplay, and everything else in between, definitely make sure to subscribe and also activate that notification bell. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time.